Okay, so we got another project going today on this 95 BMW 325i, and what I'll be doing is replacing both front wheel bearing hubs just as a routine maintenance. And also there was a little bit of howling noise coming out from the front end, so it sounds like the bearings are getting a little bit tired. But in general, what I'll do is jack the car up, pull off the front wheel, remove the brake caliper, remove the disc brake rotor, and then pull the hub off, and then press the new hub on with a BMW tool. There are other ways around it. You could tap it on very gently and then use the spindle nut to press it the rest of the way on, but it's not recommended to do it that way, but it can be done if you're very careful. But we'll get into that later. For now, we'll get everything off and then go over the bearings that I picked up, and then we'll take it from there. All right. Alright, so before I pull this wheel off, I just want to go over a small detail that I like to do, and that is to mark the rim to the rotor, so when I put this back together it will go on in the same spot it was before it was pulled off. And that just helps with any type of balancing issues that may come up. Unless you're putting new rotors on, then you don't have to mark it, but if you're reusing your disc brake rotor, then it's good to mark it. So I have the valve stem of the tire facing the ground, and what I do is I put a mark on the rim and then also one right on the rotor in the back here. And that's it. Then you can pull the wheel off and put it back on the same way it was. Alright. Okay, so what we'll do first is go ahead and break loose the set screw that holds on the rotor to the hub. And what I want to do is lock the rotor from spinning, so I have a flathead screwdriver that I'll stick through the caliper into the cooling grooves on the rotor, and that will lock it in. For the set screw, I have a 6mm Allen, so put that in there. And we'll just loosen it a few turns. As later on I'll get a mallet and hit the rotor to break it loose from the hub. So for now we'll move on to removing the caliper, then we'll take it from there. Okay, so next what we'll do is prep the caliper for removal. On the driver's side we have a brake pad wear sensor that's sitting inside the brake pad. So we have to remove this, and it's held in at the brake bleeder valve here. And to get it out, you can use some needle nose pliers and gently grab onto it and lift it straight out. So when this wears down against the rotor, it triggers the brake pad wear sensor light inside the car, and once that happens you'll have to replace this sensor, and that plugs into the junction box in here, so it's pretty easy to change out. So we'll set that to the side. Another thing that we might have to do is spread the brake caliper, because most likely you'll have a ridge built up on the outside of your rotor, and that will hang up the brake pads when you try and pull off the caliper. So using a good sized flathead screwdriver, I go in between the cooling slots here on the rotor and just gently pry the caliper out towards me. And you only need a little bit, so just go gentle with it and try and get as much as you can out of it, and that will loosen it up. So what we'll do now is take a peek behind the caliper and look at the two mounting bolts and go over which ones we have to take out. Alright. Alright, so on the back side of the caliper we have two bolts that we'll remove. We got this lower one here and also this upper one right here. So these are 16mm. So we'll crack these loose, take them off, pull off the caliper and hang it. Okay, so I already loosened the caliper bolts back here, and I used a breaker bar. You know, this one's about 18 inches, because these bolts are torqued on to around 80 foot-pounds, so you'll need a pretty good size ratchet to take them off, or a breaker bar. So one thing is getting this one off here on top. The brake line is kind of in the way, so what I use is a wobble extension, and here's just a regular one over here, but as you can see it's tapered. So what that does is, in case someone doesn't know about this, it allows the socket to pivot just a little bit, and it comes in handy getting around objects. So in this case it works really well on this top bolt. I can just clear that brake line here. Okay, so before I pull this off completely, well, what I'll do is hang up the caliper onto the top of the coil spring. So basically, what I'll do is I won't use this bungee cord, but I'll hook it on to the coil spring and then hang the caliper off the other end. And that's because you don't want to put any tension on the brake line here. So I have this piece of wire that I've been using for a while now, so I'll just hang it off of this. Okay, and also we want to disconnect the brake line from the grommet. So just slide it out of the strut here, so it has a little bit of chicken. And I'll snap my wire in. That's it. Okay, so I'll grab a rubber mallet and we'll knock this rotor off, and then we'll take it from there. Alright, so with the caliper off, we can go ahead and take this rotor off. So it is corroded on to the hub, so it's just not going to come off by itself without some persuasion. So we have our set screw loosened just a little bit, and I have a rubber mallet here. And what you don't want to do is hit the friction surface, although it would come off a lot easier if you could. But we want to concentrate on the base of the rotor. And then take our set screw out. And that's it, one rotor out. Okay, I'll get prepped and we'll go ahead and take this dust seal off. Okay, so with the rotor off, we can go ahead and pull off this dust cap here. And one thing I noticed is that this hub is really tight. It's hard to turn. So, you know, this bearing job was definitely needed. So I have a cross chisel that I'll use to go in between the hub and the lip on this cap seal here. So I got my mini hammer, and we'll just deform it until it pops out of there. Okay, there it is. Alright, so what we have to do next is use this cross chisel, and we need to knock the tabs off where it's pinched on the nut here. Basically, they hammered this in so it would lock into the spindle. So we'll just hammer those back. That's good there. Okay, so this nut here is a 46mm nut, and if you don't have an impact gun, then you'll need a breaker bar that's at least 24 inches long, because this is torqued on to about 200 foot-pounds here. There it is there. Alright, so I'll get prepped and get my puller out, and we'll press this hub off. Okay, so to remove the hub, I'll use a 2-jaw puller. You could use a 3-jaw puller as well. And the puller has to be wide enough to fit over this hub here, and this hub is 5.5 inches across. So I'll use this one today. This one's more traditional. This is a hub puller, and this has adjustable feet on it, and there are some with stationary feet, so they have a couple of different designs out there. And this just bolts on using your lug nuts. So I'll use this adapter, which is a spare 13mm socket, and an Allen bolt here, which I'll fit into the stub shaft. And I'm using this as a guide mainly. So then we'll fit this puller onto the hub. And we'll pull it off. Sometimes these hubs just slide right off with just hand pressure, so you may want to check that first. Okay, so the inner race is stuck on the stub here, so that's pretty common. So what we'll do is we'll use another tool to press the inner race off. And I have this Posi-Lock 2-ton puller. It's model number 103, which you can pick up at Sears, and this works really well. So this race here has a lip on it that I can bite onto with these teeth. But on some aftermarket bearings, there is no lip or groove on the inner race like this one here. It's just flush here. And these are pretty difficult to get off if you come across these. And what I use to get these off is a pair of channel locks, and carefully, without nicking the stub here, I'll grab on to the outside of the race and I'll work it off as much as I can, and then once I have enough clearance, I'll fit my 3-jaw puller behind it and then slide it off the stub. So with the AFG and SKF bearings, you shouldn't have that problem. They all should have that groove, and I'll show you that in a sec. So you can tighten down the jaws with this adjustment here, so you get a really good grip with this tool. And you can just press it off. Okay, so here's that groove, and if you don't pick up a tool just like this, whatever jaw that you pick up, just make sure the jaws are pretty narrow so they can bite this lip here, because the lip is not very wide. And that's about it. So what I'll do from here is clean up the stub shaft here, and what you don't want to use is sandpaper. The best thing I found to clean this up with is steel wool. It does a good job. And I'll clean up the ABS sensor, which is right here. I'll clean this up because it gets pretty gummed up. And you can use brake cleaner or Purple Power degreaser in there. And looking at the inner dust seal, it looks pretty good, so I'll leave that in there. If I was going to pull that out, I would use needle nose vice grips and I'd work it out on either side, and then I tapped a new one in with a 2-inch diameter pipe, either plastic pipe or metal pipe. So they're pretty easy to change out. So I'll get that cleaned up and then we'll move on to the next step. Alright, so for wheel bearings, I picked up some SKF bearings for this project. It's also referred to as the Wheel Hub. And the deal with SKF is that they're a good company, and you may find that you already have SKF bearings installed on your car. The other brand that I like to use is FAG. This is just an example of their packaging, and this one's for the rear wheel bearing actually. These two brands are really good, and one thing I noticed with the SKF bearings is that they spin really smoothly. You know, it feels like butter compared to a lot of aftermarket bearings I've looked at. So on the parts list we have the outer dust cap, and I do have 2 of these. The inner dust protection collar that sits over the axle stub, and these are, well, these only have to be replaced if they're corroded, so most likely you won't have to replace this. And also one thing I want to bring up is how this works is when this sits on the axle stub, the wheel bearing goes on and the dust seal kind of rides in the middle of this groove here on the bearing. So it has a recessed groove here. Now I'm bringing this up because on some aftermarket bearings, if you go that route, this recessed groove does not exist, and 90% of the time you'll have a rubbing issue with the inner dust seal. So you go to bolt your new wheel hub on, torque it down, and you go to spin it, and then you notice that it's not spinning, it's binding, and that's because it's rubbing on the inner seal here. So I've learned to definitely check for that groove here, make sure it has a nice recessed groove if you're going with any aftermarket bearings. Then we have our collar nut and the brake disc rotor retainer screw, and you know, these usually strip out when you take these off. Not all the time, but it could happen, and BMW does recommend replacing these, so it's good to have a couple of these on hand. And that's it for parts. What we have here is a BMW tool, which we'll use to press the new hub on to the axle stub, also known as the spindle. So we'll be using this today. Now there are other ways to get your bearing on to the stub axle where you can tap it on, but like I said, it's not recommended, but I'll go ahead and go over that just in case you cannot obtain one of these tools here. And that's about it. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started on it. Okay, so I just finished prepping for the new bearing and hub assembly, and I cleaned up the stub shaft here with steel wool. I cleaned up the ABS sensor, and I also cleaned up the mounting pads here on the steering knuckle where the caliper mounts. So these are nice and smooth. And also on the back side of the caliper, I cleaned those mounting pads up as well. Then I took a wire brush and just went in and cleaned things up where the caliper bolts go through, and also in here where the threads are in the caliper. I cleaned those out. I also took the time to tighten up the nuts here. There's 3 nuts that hold on the dust guard, and these loosen up over time, so I come in and tighten these up whenever I get a chance. And usually when they loosen up, you end up getting a rattle when you hit bumps. This will make noise. And that's pretty much it for prepping. What I'll do now is go over the procedure that I use to install hubs without the BMW tool. So the tool I use is a seal driver tool here. Well, it's for races and seals, and this comes with different size adapters like these guys here. This one right here is the largest one. It's about 2 inches in diameter, and it has a good surface area to help line up the bearing and drive it on as straight as possible. So in this case, I do add a little bit of lube to the stub shaft here, because you would need all the help you can get to get it on. And you get your bearing on, and then put your tool in there, and you want to gently tap it on. You don't want to hit it too hard because it'll damage the bearing, and it may take a while, but just do little taps until you bottom out against the stub shaft here with your tool, and that will be as far as you can go. Once you get to that point, you can use like a 38mm socket and then tap it on the rest of the way. And really you only need to go as far in as the threads. Once the threads are exposed, you can take your collar nut and thread it on and press the hub on the rest of the way, and then torque it down the factory specs. And that's about it. It's about a 3-phase operation to get the hub on without the special tool. So I'll get prepped and get my BMW tool out, and we'll go ahead and install our new hub. Alright. Alright, so before we get started, we'll go over this BMW tool real quick here. So there's 3 pieces to it. You have your hub guide right here, and then we have our pusher, and on the back we have a thrust bearing, which really helps to reduce friction and makes pressing that hub on much easier. So to get started, we'll go ahead and remove the thrust bearing and the pusher. Then we can thread this on to the stub shaft here. And hand tight should be sufficient. So before we slide the hub on, you want to make sure that there's no debris in here. It's got to be really clean. And the BMW TIS does not mention anything about lubricating the stub shaft here. There is a little bit of oil in here from the factory, so I'll leave that in there and just use that. And slide it on as far as it will go. Put your pusher on and our thrust bearing. Okay, so I'll just use a crescent wrench. It's 12-inch. And we'll drive it on until it's all the way home. Okay, so I just felt it stop there, and that's it. So what I'll do from here is pull off this tool, and then I'll get my torque wrench and we'll go ahead and torque the collar nut on, and then we'll take it from there. All right. Okay, so we're ready to go ahead and put our new collar nut back on. So we'll thread that on there. So we'll torque this down to 213 foot-pounds, which is equivalent to about 290 Newton meters. So I have my torque wrench that goes up to 250 foot-pounds, and it's set at 213 foot-pounds right now, and I'm using a 46 millimeter socket. Okay, with that torqued, we can use the cross chisel and hammer over the tip of the collar into those grooves here on the stub shaft, so we can lock it in there. Okay, so with our collar nut locked in, we can go ahead and put the dust cap on. I went ahead and applied a really thin bead of black RTV silicone to the inside edge, and that will just help keep moisture and dust out. So I usually just use a rubber mallet to tap these in. Wipe the excess RTV off, and that's it. So I'll get that rotor and we'll go ahead and start assembling the rest of this. Okay, so with our hub all buttoned up here, we can go ahead and put our rotor back on. I took a few minutes and cleaned the inside of the rotor and also the outside using a fiber disc, and this is the finest grit fiber disc, and I just cleaned it up so there would be a good flat surface. You could use a wire brush as well. So we can go ahead and install this. Okay, we have our new retainer screw with a dab of anti-seize lubricant added to it. So we'll leave that hand tight for now. So I want to go ahead and just clean this rotor up with some brake cleaner. Just to get the grease off of it. So for the caliper bolts here, BMW does state to add a little bit of lubricant to these bolts, and I personally like to use blue Loctite because it acts as a lubricant, and plus you have the added benefit of it locking the bolts in. So I'll use this instead of oil. Okay, let's cinch it down. Alright. So these bolts, the caliper bolts call for 81 foot-pounds, and that comes out to 110 Newton meters. Yeah, it's locked in. So now we can take our brake pad wear sensor and snap this back in. And our brake hose grommet can go back onto the strut. And the last thing we can do is tighten up our set screw, so we'll put the screwdriver back in to lock the rotor. And this calls for 12 foot-pounds. And that's it. So from here, I'll grab the wheel and we'll go ahead and mount it on. Alright. Okay, so we're just about ready to wrap this up with this wheel install. So I took some time and cleaned up the surface area on the back of the rim, and what I'll do now is add a little grease to the inside here where the hub fits into, and the wheel moves around a little, so they want that lubed up in there. So for grease, I'll use caliper grease. You can use wheel bearing grease if you want. And we'll go ahead and mount the wheel now. Okay, so I have a white match mark on the rotor, and I have my match mark here, so I'll just line them up. Looks good. Okay, I'll just snug them just a little bit. Okay, so we'll put the car on the ground. Not completely, but just a little. That should be good. Okay, so the torque specs for this calls for, well, 88 to 95 foot-pounds, and that's basically 120 newton meters plus or minus 10 newton meters. So I'll go to 90 foot-pounds. But if you have aftermarket rims, then I would check with the rim manufacturer for torque specs. And that's it. So I hope this helped someone out, and thanks for watching.